The Consequences of Deportation of the Masafer Yatta Communities on Women and Girls, a feminist position paper based on UN Security Council Resolution 1325. It is like hell, as if we are living on borrowed time, no stability, no safe haven. How am I supposed to feel as a mother with my children witnessing the demolitions? Not once nor twice, but several times. It does not get any easier. Each time it hurts all over again. When the army arrives to demolish, the children stand there and watch. I cannot spare them the sights. These sights are here always and everywhere. Suad, a pseudonym. This position paper aims to serve as a platform to the voices of Palestinian women who are threatened with deportation from their homes in Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills. 12 women from 8 villages, all under pseudonyms for their own safety, will tell the stories of communities that are on the verge of collective deportation on ethnic grounds, all under the guise of legal reasoning. Deportation is a violent act, displacement from the house and the memories, from our being and existence. While we, the readers, experience it, perhaps, as a one-off act, in practice, deportation is a continuous act over time, a sense of helplessness and constant fear. Each day, a cloud hovers over, and danger lurks at the dawn of each day, every day. Women in conflict zones are more vulnerable. In addition to the terrible difficulties and horrendous suffering that armed conflicts and fighting leave behind among the general population, there are other dimensions that affect women and girls in these situations in a special and different way. The unique experiences of the women are often blurred within the general group distress. If there is no adequate representation of their voices, and as long as they are excluded from the decision-making platforms of managing or ending the conflict, these experiences will never be brought to the decision-making table, and they will disappear into an abyss. In the year 2000, this insight led the UN Security Council to adopt Resolution 1325 regarding women, peace, and security. The resolution recognizes the necessity of protecting women from different populations from all types of violence, both in the private and the public spheres, as well as the need for equal protection of women in decision-making as an inseparable part of the sought protection. Women's equal participation is the only guarantee for implementing a gender analysis that does not ignore women's needs and their exacerbated vulnerabilities. Among other things, Resolution 1325 emphasizes the serious consequences of displacement from homes on women. Expressing concern that civilians, particularly women and children, account for the vast majority of those adversely affected by armed conflict, including as refugees and internally displaced persons, and increasingly are targeted by combatants and armed elements. As was recognized again in Resolution 2122 of the Security Council of 2013, a resolution which especially addressed the issue of vulnerability of women following displacement. From the resolution, expressing concern at women's exacerbated vulnerability in armed conflict and post-conflict situations, particularly in relation to forced displacement, as a result of unequal citizenship rights, gender bias application of asylum laws, and obstacles to registering and accessing identity documents which occur in many situations. The interviews with the 12 women were conducted in the aftermath of the High Court of Justice decision to legalize the de facto deportation of 8 villages from the Masafer Yatta communities. As a result, and in order to reach the villages, we were required to pass military checkpoints deployed in an area that was declared a firing zone, to risk confiscation of our vehicle, and to enter a closed military zone. In order to ensure that women felt safe to speak without putting themselves and their families at risk, we moved around a very large mountainous, rocky space to reach each of the women. Throughout this position paper, quotes from the interviews we conducted with the women will be presented under key subsections that express the main hardships, but certainly do not exhaust them. First, an overview of the place and the general plight of the communities will be presented to explain how their lives are frozen without the ability to develop and exist with dignity. Later, we will discuss the unique situation of Masafer Yatta communities who live in an area that has been declared a firing zone, which has led to the further dispossession and despair of the communities. In the meantime, we will investigate the legal proceedings that have concluded and delegitimized the de facto deportation. In the third chapter, The main issues of concern to the community's women will be the physical and symbolic meaning of the loss of a home, the serious damage to the right to education, and the fear that the progress they have made over the years will be halted, the huge lack of basic health services that cause unique suffering to women, the feeling of being trapped inside a space without the ability to move freely, the fear of losing one's livelihood, the exposed lives of women whose privacy was taken away from them, their lives in the shadow of constant fear, and the mental consequences they bear alone in silence, the lack of dreams, the deprivation of childhood and of the ability to dream of a better future. And of course, like everywhere else in the world, the social and gender violence that strikes and worsens in times of crisis. And women are the first to bear the brunt. All of this takes place in a broader political context, intersections of oppression that are clearly manifested in the domestic, personal space. Therefore, in the concluding chapter, we will insist on reading the plights of women not as isolated from, but rather as part of a long-standing policy of oppression on ethnic grounds, of occupation and military control, of settler colonialism and striving to cleanse the territory of its local inhabitants. The call to the general public in Israel, Palestine, and the world is first and foremost a call to stop the lurking deportation, but nonetheless, and not in isolation from that, is a call for a clear claim that these communities, these women, deserve rights to self-determination, freedom, dignity, equality, and the right to live in a sovereign state. The interviews were conducted in the women's language, the Arabic language, so that words and language difficulties would no longer be a barrier. We met the women in their homes, in space closest to their hearts. A house can be a cave, a tent, a concrete room, or a shack. In the eyes of the women, this is their palace, said Samia, one of the inspiring women we met. They are not ready to give up this house, however modest it may be. It was very important to meet the women in their space. That way, they would not have to mediate reality to us through descriptions. We could see it around us and its gloomy and disturbing setting. In addition, all interviews were conducted with only women around. Sometimes the interviewee was alone, and sometimes her daughters or neighbors were present, each according to her own preferences. This is the place to point out that this position paper also relies to a large extent on the ongoing legal support of some of the men and women of the communities and support of courageous men and women, activists for human rights, who are present every day in the field, Palestinians and Israelis. Finally, this position paper is published after the elections of the 25th Knesset. The emerging government is expected to continue the policies of its predecessors and even escalate and deepen the oppression. As will be shown later, now, after the legal process in Israel against the deportation has come to an end, the decision when and how the deportation will be carried out is in the hands of these political entities. This means that only through a persistent struggle and an unequivocal and clear statement by democratic forces, as well as by the international community, will it be possible to prevent it. Chapter 1. The Chronicles of Dispossession. The Masafer Yatta area, in the southeastern corner of the West Bank and under Israeli military occupation, is located in the area referred to as Area C, following the Oslo Agreement. About 60% of the West Bank territories are subject to Israeli military control, both at the security level and at the civilian level. This means that the Palestinian residents are essentially subjects under a foreign military regime that exclusively controls all areas of their lives: construction, education, connection to infrastructure, movement, services, and above all, total control of the right to self-determination. The area has been inhabited by Palestinians for over a century. Beginning in the 19th century, Palestinian families from the town of Yatta began to move to the Masafer Yatta area in search of a livelihood and a comfortable place to live. The residents who left the villages used the land suitable for agricultural cultivation and the pastures suitable for grazing for their livelihood, while using the caves and the lands for residence. At first, they lived in the caves they dug, and later, at the beginning of the 20th century, the communities began to develop, grow, and accordingly, new houses began to be built above ground. To this day, the residents rely mainly on agriculture and sheep herding, which they use for their own consumption as well for sale in the city of Yatta and the surrounding area to support their households. As mentioned, In addition to the military, the communities are subject to the civilian dimension as well, in the sense that the Israeli military authorities, known as the civil administration, control the planning and development of villages, issuing of construction permits, connections to infrastructure, water, electricity, and road construction. They are also supposed to be responsible for building public institutions and providing health services, welfare, education, etc. This paper is too short to cover all the daily hardships that the residents endure at the same time. In order to get the big picture, it is important to present the long-standing policy that leaves the communities in a kind of stagnation, preventing them from developing, building, working, moving, and receiving their basic rights. The military and civil administration consider the villages of Masafer Yatta as unrecognized villages. Therefore, the residents are treated as illegal dwellers, trespassing into a land not their own. Among other things, the military authorities do not approve master plans for the development of the villages or any new construction, including houses, public institutions, agricultural facilities, electricity and water infrastructures, sheep dwelling, schools, clinics, roads, and more. As will be revealed later in the testimony, schools that were nevertheless established are under constant threat of demolition. The women worked during the day and the men during the night so that we could build the school. Thanks to our persistence, the high school today serves the entire area, Kifach told us. Also, the residents who need health care are required to go to the city of Yatta, on the back of the donkey, as Kamar testified. Since there are no paved roads, and most of the residents cannot afford to purchase vehicles due to the economic hardship. Even construction in process is always subject to the threat of demolition. They threaten that if we do not leave, they will destroy the cave that serves as a home, said Samia. The residents of the villages are only partly provided with electricity, and this is only due to humanitarian and public activity. In recent years, the Me Comet organization has installed local electricity systems based on wind and solar energy in some villages. However, even these facilities are under constant threat of demolition by orders issued by the civil administration. There is no clearer example of the residents' struggle for the basic right to electricity and the price involved than the shooting of Haroun Abu Aram, a Palestinian youth from Khirbat al-Rakiz. On January 1st, 2021, Abu Aram was shot in the neck only because he tried to oppose the confiscation of a generator by the civil administration soldier. He was rendered paralyzed from the neck down. His mother, Farsa, told us about the pain of seeing her son shot in front of her eyes. On the day Haroun was shot, we were preparing for lunch for the whole family, including Haroun's fiancée at the time. They separated after Haroun was left paralyzed. The army came to the neighbor's house and wanted to confiscate the generator. Haroun's father ran there, followed by Haroun. When I saw him running, I ran too. Haroun grabbed a generator that the army wanted to confiscate. One of the soldiers pointed the rifle at his neck and shot him. When Haroun collapsed, I felt an earthquake hit. I saw him fall before my eyes. I felt as though all was lost. All. A tremendous crisis that only worsens is the water shortage. The residents who live in areas that are not connected to water, such as the residents of Masafer Yatta, depend on rainwater that they collect in wells and on private contractors from whom they purchase water. Purchasing water involves high financial costs, both for the water itself and for expensive transportation, because the roads are not paved. These prices can reach thousands of shekels every month. As for the rainwater stored in the cisterns, some of the cisterns are located on lands that have been declared state lands, or those that are within the jurisdiction of settlements, in a way that makes reaching them an impossible task, according to Samia, and deprives the women of the ability to reach and draw the water, as we used to do always, due to the danger involved in reaching places where there are settlers and the need to coordinate with the army. Hamar added, and the wells we dig near the house to relieve us of the high costs of purchasing water are being destroyed. Here was a well they destroyed. The declaration of a firing zone. In 1980, the Israeli army declared approximately 33,000 dunams of Masafer Yatta lands as firing zones for the purpose of military training. The firing zones control the lands of the communities from Masafer Yatta. Declaring firing zones for training purposes is a well-known practice. Today, about 18% of the West Bank areas are declared firing zones, on the grounds that the area is needed for military training. However, under the guise of firing zones, the residents' rights to their private lands are being confiscated. The movement of the local Palestinian population is restricted. The possibility of construction is prevented, and the access of farmers to their lands is blocked. But the real reason behind the declaration of a firing zone in Masafer Yatta can be learned from the documents that have been revealed over the years. For example, the transcript of a meeting of the Settlement Committee, a body shared by the government and the World Zionist Organization. Ariel Sharon, the Minister of Agriculture at the time, noted, as the one who initiated the firing zones in 1967, the purpose of the firing zones was to maintain a land reserve. From another document from July 1981, in which Sharon reveals the motivation behind the declaration of Firing Zone 918, it appears that the declaration was intended to serve as a buffer between the Palestinians in the southern West Bank and the Bedouin community in the Negev within the borders of the Green Line. We want to offer you training areas at the border in the foothills of the Hebron Mountain to the Judean desert. I witnessed a phenomenon that I explained earlier of the spread of the rural mountain Arab communities on the back of the mountain towards the desert. We are definitely interested in increasing the areas there. Legal proceedings. For years after the announcement, the residents continued to live on their lands with the threat of deportation hovering over their heads. In 1999, about 20 years after the announcement, about 700 residents were evicted from their homes on the grounds that they were illegally living in a firing zone. Their caves were sealed, pits and houses were destroyed, and their property was confiscated. Immediately after the deportation, the first petition was submitted by the residents of 12 villages, represented by the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and attorney Shlomo Lecker. And the High Court issued an interim order instructing the army to return the deported residents to their homes until a final decision is given in the petition. We were expelled from our homes. We stayed in the village of Al-Tufula for 4 months, far from our herd, far from the water holes, far from the houses. I remember when we received the court decision that allowed us to return, I was in the middle of wheat threshing. My husband asked me to leave everything, to pack things so that we could immediately return to our home, Samia recalled in an interview. 12 years later, in July 2012, the Army submitted its response to the High Court, in which it claimed that these are not permanent residents entitled to remain in their lands. The Army also announced that in the northwestern part of the firing zone, where there are 4 villages and settlements, training will take place without live ammunition, so that the residents of the villages and the settlements can continue to live there. Regarding the 8 villages in the remaining territory, the state announced it intends to destroy them. Based on this announcement, a new petition was submitted in January 2013, seeking to prevent the forced transfer of the residents of the villages, to regulate their residence there, and to cancel the declaration of the firing zones. Once again, an interim order was issued ordering that the residents stay in their homes until a final decision is made. For 9 years, the residents of the villages waited for a decision. In May 2022, the High Court rejected the positions of the Palestinian residents while accepting the state's factual and legal claims. Several controversial legal claims were adopted as a basis for the court ruling, legalizing the de facto deportation. On top was Judge David Mintz, a resident of the settlement of Dolev. Several controversial legal claims were adopted as a basis for the court ruling legalizing de facto deportation. On top was Judge David Mintz's. He is a resident of the settlement of Dolev. His decision, according to which the Article 49 of the IVGC concerning the protection of civilians in times of war, from 1949, which prohibits the forced deportation of a protected population, does not apply in this case, since it is a non-binding treaty law, as opposed to customary law, which has a higher normative rank. The High Court of Justice determined, in a precedent and contrary to previous rulings, that Israeli law and military legislation prevail over international law. Jurists and international law experts pointed out the many legal difficulties involved in this decision. In October 2022, the Supreme Court rejected the Civil Rights Association's request for another hearing before an extended composition on the grounds that it is not a matter of new precedents establishing grounds for another hearing. In October 2022, the Supreme Court rejected the Civil Rights Association's request for another hearing before an extended group of judges on the grounds that it is not a matter of new precedents establishing grounds for another hearing. Although the president of the Supreme Court, Judge Esther Hayut, expressed reservations about some of the determinations in this case that caused difficulty in the verdict, especially regarding the supremacy of military legislation over international law, the president saw them as incidental statements that do not change the results of the proceedings. Thus, the legal battle in Israel came to an end. Immediately after the decision, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Territories, appealed to the prosecutor at the ICC in The Hague to act to prevent the deportation of the residents of Masafer Yatta, which is contrary to the Fourth Geneva Convention, on the grounds that the transfer of a protected population from an occupied territory, the ramifications of the court decision. Now the fate of over 1,000 members of the communities, their women and elders, is under real threat. If the deportation takes place, it will be the largest deportation carried out in the occupied territories since the 1970s. De facto deportation also means the destruction of the residents' exclusive livelihood, which relies on agriculture and sheep herding due to the blocking of access to their land. Even if the deportation does not take place immediately, the results of the High Court's ruling are already disastrous. The High Court's decision accelerates the execution of over 360 demolition orders issued against the members of the communities in Masafer Yatta. In the days following the decision, and according to reports from activists in the field, on May 11, 2022 and June 1, 2022, the homes of dozens of Palestinian residents were destroyed in Kherbat al-Farkhit and Al-Markaz. For some, this is the second and third demolition within a year. Later on June 7, 2022, demolition orders were issued against all the houses in Kherbat al-Taban, and the following days, demolition orders were issued against buildings in Khalat at-Abana. In October of 2022, the Supreme Court rejected the petition of the residents of Khalat al-Daba against the demolition of the village's houses. Khalat al-Daba is expected to be the first village to be completely destroyed. The demolition of all the residential buildings and sheep huts and facilities appears to be the last step. In the meantime, the military forces began an operation to document the faces and identity details of all the residents of Masafer Yatta. On June 15, 2022, an announcement was made regarding the beginning of a military training exercise in the area. And on June 21, 2022, the training exercise began, as part of which the Israeli military placed dozens of barriers that prevent the entry of anyone who is not a resident of the villages, including human rights activists, while confiscating vehicles, authorized and unauthorized alike, of anyone who enters. The release of vehicles, including work vehicles, involves expenses totaling thousands of shekels. Also, training targets were deployed close to populated residential areas. As will be detailed later, during the training period, the right of school students to movement and to education was fatally violated. The interviews in this paper were conducted during these difficult days. Chapter 2: The Unique Consequences for Women, Girls, and Children. Out of a population of approximately 1,720 Palestinian residents in Masafer Yatta communities, including those threatened with deportation, there are approximately 844 women, constituting 49% of the population. About half of the women in the communities are under the age of 18. These data emphasize even more the importance of bringing the gender perspective, which examines the broad and far-reaching consequences of freezing the lives of the communities and their expulsion and dispossession of their land and their homes and all that it implies. The loss of home. When my house was destroyed, I felt trapped. As mentioned above, the communities live in a kind of planning stagnation. There is no possibility for new construction of any kind, and now the existing buildings are also in danger of demolition, while the people are in real danger of deportation. Losing one's home has a particularly hard effect on women, especially women from disadvantaged or persecuted groups. Researcher Professor Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian wrote that Palestinian women treat their homes as the safest place. They take the traditional role of women in the domestic space and turn it into a site of renewal, of growth, and of protection for themselves and their families. Moreover, the home is one of the few places where women can find solace. The Palestinian women's home has become a place of personal protection, of identity, and of community building. We have not lost sight of the fact that the home is not necessarily a place of security for all women, and that many women prefer not to stay in private space. However, in today's reality, especially in political minority groups, the home, in most cases, creates a place of refuge where they can care for and support their children in times of fear and can work and help provide for the family while at the same time maintaining a constant presence. Correspondingly, the loss of the home means erosion in the meanings of their presence and human being. Unlike the men, whose focus of life is outside of the house, in the pastures and agricultural lands, and who are seen as being able to survive without having a roof to protect them, the house for the women is the anchor for their existence. The fear of losing the house was the central theme in the interview. All the women interviewed, like most of the other women from Masafer Yatta, take a central and exclusive part in raising the children and doing the household work. They describe the experience of house demolition and deportation as the destruction of life. We met with Samia, 55 years old and a mother of 13. She lives in a man-made cave with her family in Al-Tufula. In the interview with Samia, her daughter sat around her, and it was clear that they heard repeatedly the hardships their parents went through in raising them and working hard so as to afford to send them to study at university. For 33 years, I have lived in this cave. Since my marriage, all my children were born in this cave. Samia opened the interview with these words. It was impossible to miss the sense of urgency in Samia's voice. Later, we realized that she had already experienced the demolition of a house, so it was real fear that she experienced. A year after the marriage, the army destroyed our cave. They also took all the furniture we had and left us with nothing. They also destroyed the barn. I remember then that I insisted on saving the wooden crib of my baby, who was a few months old at the time. At least the baby would have a place to sleep. It took us 2 years to recarve the cave. For Samia and her family, this is not the first deportation. In 1999, they were expelled from their homes, together with 700 residents of the communities, and returned only after a few months due to the High Court's decision, as part of the interim order aforementioned. I remember that one day I was alone at home, and a senior officer came and told me that if I did not leave immediately, he would force me out. He probably thought that because I'm a woman, then I would be afraid. I was scared. It is not that I was not scared. But the kids were at school. What will they do if they come home and not find me? I mustered up the courage and did not leave, said Samia, and added with a sigh. But we knew they would not leave us. They would drive the herd away, and the herd would get scared and run away. That's why we moved it quietly to another place, and we women stayed at home to protect it. I remember sitting at the door of my house at night to watch over both the herd and my children. Later, the army started arresting the men of the family, including my brother-in-law, and allowed his release only upon leaving the house. They threatened to destroy the cave again. Some residents left out of fear, and some were forcibly expelled. We were also deported, but luckily the people of the village of Twani welcomed us. We stayed there for 4 months until the court's decision, and then we returned, she recalled. It sounded detached to ask her, how did it feel to be evicted from your home? But there was no escape asking that question. To uproot you from your home is to put your life on hold, to freeze it. It is true that we were welcome to Twani, but you are not in your home. The place is crowded. Our herd is far away. Our water holes are far away. It is difficult to move around, Samia said. And it sounded as if the words did not help her to express the weight that sat on her soul. For me, the house symbolizes all the meanings in life. I would not trade this cave for a palace. I do not sleep outside the house. Even when I go to my brother's in the city of Yatta, I go back to sleep in my house. For me, this is my place, my being. Besides, I'm in constant fear of losing the house. My house is always in danger. There is no way we can all leave the house at once. We always need someone to stay behind and guard the house. While Samia talked about a loss from the past and another that may occur soon, Suad, 37 years old and the mother of 4 children, talked about being deported in the present. Suad's family house was destroyed several times until they were forced to leave temporarily in a building that served as a clinic and was abandoned after doctors who came from time to time stopped arriving. Suad's little children, ages 3 and 4, were playing around her while her eldest daughter Amira stood there with a smile on her face, occasionally replaced by looks of helplessness at the words of her mother. It is hell. It is like we are living on borrowed time, with no stability, without a safe haven. How am I supposed to feel as a mother when my children see the ruins, not once, not twice, but several times? It does not get any easier. Every time it is enormous pain. When the army comes to destroy, the children stand there and watch. When we asked if it was possible to spare the children these sights, Suad replied, "I wish I could. I have no way to spare them. These sights are here all the time, everywhere." About the difficulty of living in the clinic, Amira, the daughter, who was reluctant to share, said, "This is not my place. I feel like I am a guest, and I cannot behave like I am at home." Unlike Suad and Amira, Kamar, a smiling 59-year-old woman full of joy for life, showed a strong desire to be interviewed and talk about the broad political context and how she views it. During the interview, Kamar sought to protest against the injustices of military control in the general sense and tended to steer away from the personal. When we insisted on asking how she, as a woman, experienced the dispossession and deportation, while emphasizing that the personal is also the political, she replied, "Seeing your house destroyed is the destruction of your life. Life falls apart into piles of broken and ruined bricks, simple as that. Soldiers come, destroy, and leave," she added with seemingly deep grief. "The day my house was destroyed, I felt trapped, just like a prisoner feels when their cell door is closed. That's how I feel to this day." Kamar has no children, and her husband remarried. "I was looking for a woman for him to marry, so as to have children with." When her house was destroyed, Kamar had to live in the same house, in a concrete room, together with her husband and his second wife. The motif of home and domesticity, and the house as the essence of being and existence, was repeated in the interviews, as well as the feelings of personal and collective crushing accompanying the ruins. The demolition is not just the demolition of the bricks of the house or the loss of the physical roof, the women emphasized. As will be immediately brought out, the wider implications are clear and intimately known to these women. They are forced to sleep in temporary tents or to move to temporary places, sometimes with neighbors or in abandoned buildings. Temporality and uncertainty shape the lives of the women and children in a way that prevents them or hinders many of them to advance on a personal and professional level. The ability of their children to acquire an education violates their privacy, hinders their health, and exposes them to physical, mental, and sexual violence. The right to an education, a long journey interrupted. Until 2009, there were no primary schools in the villages of Masafer Yatta. The nearest school was in the city of Yatta. In view of the shaky infrastructure and the avoidance of road construction, girls and boys could study at Yatta Elementary School on the condition that one of their relatives lives in that village so that they could stay with them during the school year. After elementary school, girls often dropped out of school and were relegated to domestic work. Between the years 2009 and 2018, several schools were built in the area of the South Hebron Hills and Masafer Yatta. A central school was established in Khirbat Atawani, and about 4 other small schools were established in Khirbat Susia, Dukaika, Al-Fahit, and Jinba. The story of the establishment of the Tawani school is a great success story, a community success, and a female success, said Kifach with pride. Kifach, an inspiring woman, was born in the city of Yatta, where there's electricity, water, roads, clinics, schools, and more. Since she got married and moved to Tawani, life has become very difficult. But I do not let go and I do not give up. I want to live here. In 1997, and even though we were not allowed to build, we decided, we women, that we cannot abandon our children's right to an education. It is impossible that they would have to walk dozens of kilometers to school. That's why we formed a committee and decided to build a school. Soon, the army retribution came along, and they started arresting the men and confiscating the work tools. But we continued and built 3-tiered classrooms. Later, the court issued an interim order preventing the demolition, and we, the women, took advantage of this and built more classes for more layers. Kifach told a group of women who came on tour in Tawani. Kifach pauses for a moment and smiles, her grandson running around. We women suffer from the control of both the occupation and the men. Both types of oppression are difficult. But we decided to fight. We would come and help build or guard outside the school so that the army would not come to destroy it. Today, we have a respectable school that is used by all the surrounding communities. Proof that we can, she concludes with satisfaction. The construction of the schools made education very accessible to girls who had to leave home or stay away from home to get an education. Thus, the number of girls who completed 12 years of schooling increased over the years, and many of them even joined higher education studies and were integrated into the labor market in the surrounding Palestinian cities. Today, these women lead quite a few of the struggles of the communities. Some of them founded associations for female empowerment or to help school children. Some of them participate in international conferences in order to voice the plights and demands of the residents. The road was not easy at all. Throughout the interview, Samia discussed that she was proud of her sons and daughters who succeeded despite all the difficulties in acquiring a higher education. They all study at the university, she said, with the pride of someone who worked hard so she could be entitled to say this sentence. There is no school in the village of Tuba, Samia's village. The children of the village attend the Twani school, which is about 2 kilometers away on foot. For years now, the children of Tuba, who want to go to their school, have encountered a grave deal of harassment from the settlers of the illegal outpost Chavat Ma'on, which is located between the two villages. In order to escape the harassment and attacks, the children had to take a very long detour, almost 7 kilometers, to reach their school safely. Those who overcame the barrier of the fear of harassment and the long and exhausting road were very few. They were prevented from taking this road. They had to make a very long detour to get to the school on donkeys, and it took them about 2 hours each way. We would put them on the donkey's back and send them to school. There were no phones then. We could not make sure they arrived safely. Their father would finish his work and then follow them to school to make sure they arrived safely. I would sit on a hill and wait for them to come back out of fear, Samia said. In 2004, after a long series of harassment and attacks by the settlers, the Special Committee for the Status of the Child in the Israeli Knesset concluded that the army would escort the children from their village to the school in the morning and back in the afternoon. And this is the practice even today. A handful of small children walk, while a military jeep drives behind them. Sometimes the students wait a long time until the soldiers come to escort them, and sometimes they do not show up at all. Asil, Samia's daughter, now studying management and communication at the university, recalled those days. The school period was beautiful, but difficult. I remember the days when the soldiers would arrive in their jeep and we would walk ahead of them. It was about an hour-and-a-half walk. We would get to school exhausted and tired. Many times the soldiers would be late in the morning, and then we would also arrive late and miss classes. And the same way on the way back from school. There were days when the army did not come to pick us up, and we would miss school. I remember once, someone who studied in my class arrived with all her clothes wet from the rain. She arrived, but immediately returned home again because she was shivering and cold. In her words, Asil was sorry for all the boys and girls who could not make it through the difficult path. Many students dropped out of school because of these difficulties. In my grade, only 8 of us finished school, even though the original number was 25 students when we started. But some of them could not endure the attacks and delays. Since the High Court's decision and following the announcement of live ammunition training in the firing zone in Masafer Yatta, military roadblocks have been deployed throughout the area, delaying the residents for hours, including school students and teachers. In most cases, the military forces also confiscate the vehicles and conduct searches in their bags. In the early days of the 2022 school year, a military checkpoint was positioned near the village of Fachit, where there is a central school that is used by the residents of the villages in the firing zone. At the checkpoint, 40 school students were detained. The soldiers ordered the students and teachers to sit on the ground in the middle of the desert, and they were kept in the sun for over an hour. Later, they were allowed to walk to school after the bus was confiscated. Hanan, a student at the school in Fachit, was not interested in sharing too much and was content to count how many students stopped coming to school due to the roadblocks and delays on the way. Now we are 3 girls in the class. Some of them stopped coming to school. Because of the barriers, people started arriving in secluded and dangerous detour. When asked how she felt about this, she answered, "It's a great injustice. That way I cannot see my friends either. The school is the only place where we could meet because they live far away. The bulldozers emerged, accompanied by army and security forces, and later destroyed the building in front of the crying eyes of the students, some of whom will not return to school." The school experience, which is supposed to be an empowering and enriching experience and an arena for social involvement, became a repeated and continuous trauma every morning and at the end of every school day. If the situation continues like this, and if the deportation is carried out, one of the devastating consequences will be on the future of girls, who will usually be forced to stop their studies and cut short the long journey they have made in the last decade. If the situation continues like this, and if the deportation is carried out, one of the devastating consequences will be on the future of the girls, who will most likely be forced to stop their studies and cut short the significant progress they have made in the last decade. In her research, Shalhub Kevorkian notes that following displacement from home, young women gave up university studies to help the family cope with the financial burden. Other women rushed to marry to ease the financial burden on their families. The right to health, no access to medical services of hygiene and sanitary facilities. One of the broad consequences of the lack of infrastructure and master plans is the direct violation of the right of the residents in general and of women in particular to health and adequate access to hygiene and sanitation facilities. In any area of Masafer Yatta, there are almost no permanent clinics that serve the residents. A permanent clinic was established in the village of Twani, and it is also not staffed with adequate equipment and does not operate regularly. In 2 villages in the firing zone, clinics were operated once or twice a week, but recently they only operate intermittently. I am pregnant with my 4th child. In the 2nd month, I knew I was pregnant because I stopped getting my periods and because my face swelled up. I was examined by a doctor for the first time just a week ago, said Asma, a very smiley young woman, mother of 2, a boy and a girl. In past pregnancies, I would occasionally visit the doctors who came to our area once a week. I would go on foot or on the back of a donkey when the pregnancy progressed, or to the village of Fachit, where there was a clinic. Asma added, "But now the doctors have stopped coming, and I have to go to the city of Yatta to be tested. This can only happen very rarely." Issues related to pregnancy and childbirth came up many times when we asked to hear about the difficulties related to women. Samia, for example, was thankful to God and said, "I had no worries. I gave birth to all my children here in the cave with no problems, thank God. But now my sister-in-law is pregnant, and of course we worry about the upcoming birth. Every time my sister-in-law has to go to the doctor, there are high costs for ordering a taxi, provided they agree to come as close to the village to pick us up." Unlike Samia, Asma is very worried about giving birth. During my first pregnancy, it took me hours to get to the hospital. We do not have a car. The road is long and tiring. I remember my husband took me on a tractor, and the rugged dirt roads were dangerous. Because I was sweating and tired, we stopped in my parents' village, where I took a shower and then went to the hospital. In my last birth, they took me on a tractor straight to the hospital. The other women who told me about their birth testified that they arrived at the hospital on a donkey or in SUVs. Ambulances cannot enter the villages, testified Kamar, who suffers from various diseases and must come to the city of Yatta for treatment and to purchase medicine. Every trip to the city involves heavy burden and many costs. The smiling Asma suddenly had tears in her eyes. It turns out that this pregnancy came after her son, a toddler at the time, died during the night. It took me a while to recover from the death of my son. On the day of his death, I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning to milk the goats. It was raining very hard, and at night, after milking and helping with the sheep, I cleaned the house and did laundry. I sat down to nurse my son. He ate and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I got up and noticed that he was not moving. I started shouting and crying, she recalled. It took us hours to get to the doctor. We waited for my parents to bring a car close to the village, and then we drove to the city of Yatta. When we arrived, it was too late to save him. Asma told about the loss of her son, while shaking and smiling at the same time. How do you deal with it? Did you receive support or treatment following your loss, I wondered? I have to keep the hope. There's nothing I can do. This is our destiny, Asma said, and tried to move on to another topic. When we arrived at the village, Asma and her sister-in-law sat down to rest a little after finishing milking. Will you agree to talk with me, I asked. and she quickly answered, "Not now. I have to take a shower. We work all the time with milk, and we just finished cleaning the barn as well. First, I'll take a shower." After she showered, we sat in the cave, and she quickly apologized. "I had to shower before the men returned from the city of Yatta. They went to buy groceries. We do not have a proper shower, so I shower in a pot in the corner of the cave. That's why I had to take advantage of the time when the men are not here," she reasoned, and added, "Many times it happens to me that I need a shower but cannot shower. I must wait until there is no one home so I can shower. When I get my period, it's a nightmare. There are no toilets nearby, and no hygiene products are available, so I have to improvise solutions to stay clean." When we were nearing the end of the interview, Asma, almost my age, said with a kind of shame, as if she was dwelling on marginal issues, "Maybe it is not the most important thing, but I suffer a lot of pain when my skin gets burned by the sun. If I had sunscreen, I could maybe keep my skin healthy and protect it." Showering in a pot is not unique to Asma. All the women we interviewed shower in a pot, in the kitchen or in the corner of a room, in a designated small room. There are also no accessible toilets, and if there are any, then they are located outside the living space. You cannot go to the bathroom at night. It's scary to go out at night. So you wait until the morning. Even on rainy days, it's very difficult to get to the bathroom to relieve yourself, Kamar said, adding, "I cannot take a shower whenever I want. It's only in the dark when everyone is already asleep or when there's no one around at home. I sit in the kitchen in a pot and take a shower." Farsa, whose house is constantly full of guests who come to visit her son Harun, testified that, "We wait until it gets dark and there are no more guests, and then we shower using a pot in the corner of the cave here. If there are guests, then we shower in the kitchen." By virtue of their role in milking and producing food from the livestock and cleaning the herd's enclosures, the women must maintain increased personal cleanliness and need to shower several times a day. But this is almost impossible in view of the water shortage. As a result, the women suffer from various infectious diseases, which are also aggravated due to the lack of access to medicines and medical care. "Both my daughter and I suffer from a urinary tract infection. The little girl, 5 years old, suffers a lot from an infection. I apply ointment to her and leave her to sleep without clothes," said one of the women. The other women also repeated similar things. "The problem is that even when a doctor comes, maybe once a week, not always a female doctor arrives. So I only go to receive treatment for inflammation when a female doctor comes to the village of Jinba. The fact that I have to walk 2 hours to get there or ride a donkey, all of this worsens the inflammation, and I can hardly walk," added another woman. The significance of the ratification of the Declaration of the Firing Zone and the Declaration on Live Ammunition Training means that anyone who is not a resident of one of the villages, including doctors, risks violating the law when entering the declared closed area and is at risk of being held up in the field for a long time by the army and of confiscation of their car. In the same way, the deployment of military checkpoints in the area greatly limits the ability of the residents to exit the place and to get to the city of Yatta, even for urgent medical treatment. Freedom of movement. Women who fear being shot at once they go out. The journey to the villages within the firing zone is long, exhausting, and dangerous. We got there by jeep, yet the ride was scary. These villages are cut off from health services, public buildings, shops, and commercial centers, and are very dependent on the urban centers, and in particular the city of Yatta. Although the distance between the villages and Yatta is about 15 to 20 kilometers, getting there involves many difficulties due to the unpaved, mountainous, winding, and bumpy roads. For the local communities, which are very poor, buying a car is a privilege and is out of reach. A licensed car involves a very high financial expense due to the high taxes, both to the Palestinian authorities and to the military authorities. It is not worth putting so much money on a vehicle that will break down quickly because there are no paved roads. A vehicle that costs tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands will not last, said Fatma. As an alternative, we buy a car that has been taken off the road, which does not cost a lot of money. So even if it breaks down, the losses will not be high. Even those who can afford a car that has been taken off the road cannot always drive it, especially when there are military checkpoints. Such a vehicle is immediately confiscated, she added. The residents are left with very few options. Ride on the back of a donkey or drive work vehicles like a tractor, Samia testified. When my children had to take the Taujihi matriculation exams, they had to ride a donkey for long hours until they got to the point where they could get in a taxi and go to the city of Yatta. Women who want to go to the doctor, buy groceries or clothes, are required to make an arduous journey of hours to get to a place that can be reached by car in a short time. That's why we stopped going to the city, except in urgent cases. For example, I buy clothes once a year. My husband and the men are the ones who buy the household items. That way, the men decide what to buy and how much to buy, Kamar testified. The road is also lined with military checkpoints. In certain cases, we were delayed for hours in the search. As a result of all the turmoil, we hardly ever leave the borders of the village. We are imprisoned here. You may see an open area, but in reality, we are imprisoned, stated Kamar, and rightly so. I go to my family in the Bik'ah only once or twice a year. Do you understand? My brother is sick, and I have not had a chance to visit him yet, she added angrily. Samah, 30 years old, who got married several years ago, until then lived with her parents in Yatta, said that one of the hardest things for her is that she has no way to get around. I got married 4 years ago. Until then, I lived in the city of Yatta. Here, there is no way to leave the community. I miss my parents and cannot visit them. There is one car belonging to the neighbors, which is only requested in case of emergency. Even then, due to the winding road, it is a drive of at least an hour, and if there is an army on the way, then travel time can reach 2 or 3 hours. The soldiers delay us both on the way there and on the way back. Following the High Court's decision and the military training, the women now feel even more imprisoned. They are now also confiscating authorized vehicles, Samia said. Now we are even imprisoned inside the house and not just inside the community. A week ago, they started training with live ammunition. We see the tanks and do not dare leave the house for fear that they will shoot at us, or we will be hit by a stray bullet, Samah added. The right to work and dignified living, losing the ability to provide for the family. We get up in the morning, milk the goats, shake the milk, clean the sheep pens, then return to work in the household. We clean the house, do manual laundry, of course, and prepare food. Samah described her daily routine in the same way that almost all the women described it. Women in Masafer Yatta have an important role in providing for the home and family. They are traditionally responsible for the care and maintenance of the house, but they also have a crucial part in the household economy through the production of food that comes from the flock. Women milk the goats, shake the milk, and produce milk, cheese, butter, and other dairy products. These products are sold in the city of Yatta, and thus they contribute to the economy of the house. Move from the village to the big city may seal the fate of these women as idle and useless. What will we do in the city? Here we have our herd, the lands, and the only source of livelihood. What will I do in the city? How will I make a dignified living? Here we live in open spaces and we can lend a hand and help with the household, said Samia, and added, it is true that this is hard work, but nevertheless, it makes us feel that we are contributing and significant. The jobs the women do are hard. This difficulty is aggravated in view of the huge lack of infrastructure and, above all, the lack of access to water and electricity, as mentioned above. In recent years, and thanks to humanitarian aid, women have partial access to electricity and assistance in buying water, which makes their work easier and more efficient. Due to the instruction of infrastructure, especially in the shadow of the High Court decision, their work becomes even more arduous and difficult. We used to have a central role in pumping water from our wells, but now most of the wells are located in areas that we cannot enter, either because they are close to settlements and then we are subject to settler attacks and harassment, or they are in closed military areas and we're not allowed to enter there either, Fatma said. This means that the women were excluded from roles that they traditionally did. Due to harassment from settlers or constraints to coordinate arrival and pumping water in front of the military forces, this means that the women have been excluded from roles that they traditionally did. Due to harassment from settlers or constraints to coordinate arrival and pumping water by the military forces, the men are the ones responsible for pumping the water. But it's not that we gave up. We help wherever we can, Fatah said. While some of the women said that only men go out to the open areas to graze the herd, others protested their exclusion from this role and expressed a desire to challenge the traditional barriers. We also help with herding the sheep. My husband cannot do everything alone, so I'd lend a hand and help, including with herding the sheep, Kifach said. There is no doubt that the escalation in recent years in settler violence and now the deployment of many military forces is harming our ability to graze the herd. In general, due to settler violence and tampering with the plantings and the restriction of our movement, the grazing areas have decreased greatly, and now we must pay a lot of money to buy food for the herd, she said. What will they do if they are expelled from the areas they grew up in and the way of life they were born to? This is a question that bothers these women a lot. They do not want to sit idle, and they do not want an urban life that excludes them from their very ability to help support the household. Working, as they all agreed, is the way for them to be independent and empowered. Thus, not only considerations of livelihood and dignified existence preoccupy the women, but also what the meanings of their lives are and how they contribute to cultivating these meanings. An exposed life, lost privacy. It was important for us to reach each of the women in her own home, to see up close the conditions in which they live. With each of the women, we sat inside the cave or the room where they lived together with their family members or outside it. The houses are neat but very modest. One room that serves as a living room as well as a kitchen and also as a bedroom for all family members, men and women, boys and girls, elderly and babies. The direct meaning is that the daughters of the family, those who spend all hours of the day at home, do not have their own private space. The issue of privacy does not arise on its own, but only after we have asked them to address the issue explicitly and how much it hurts them. Well, it was very easy for them to point out tangible deprivations, such as lack of a home, clinic, or school. The women had difficulty or tended not to give room to emotional or invisible deprivation. To the question, "Are you not upset that you do not have privacy here?" Asil answered, "That is right, there is no privacy here. It seems to me that I just got used to it. I got used to being modestly dressed all day and night. I got used to wearing a head covering all the time, and I have no way to be alone a little." Asil does have more privacy in the dorms at the university, but when she returns to her family at the end of each week, she reintegrates into the routine, where she shares the space with her older brothers, their couples. Asil does have more privacy in the dorms at the university, but when she returns to her family at the end of each week, she reintegrates into the routine, where she shares the space with her older brothers, their partners, her father, and her other sisters. Asil's mother, Samia, refused to give in to the question and said, on the other hand, "I do not mind staying with the hijab. I still have to stay with the hijab because you never know when the settlers or soldiers are coming." The women we met, like the other women in Masafer Yatta, are religious and traditional women who maintain a conservative lifestyle and modest clothing, wear a hijab, and do not mix with foreign men. The shared space with the whole family, often not just the members of the nuclear family, requires them to stay in full religious clothing, including a hijab. I cannot feel free in my house. I must always be careful. I cannot take off the head covering, even when I'm cleaning the house or just sitting down to rest. Only when it gets dark at night. Only then can we take off the head covering. If you want to take off the head covering, you must lock yourself in a room and not leave it, Kamar said. The women experience a violation of privacy not only due to family religious constraints, but even more so from external factors, especially from the presence of soldiers and settlers in the area. In order to monitor new construction, the military forces and the civil administration, and often also settlers on behalf of right-wing organizations, patrol the area and among the communities and use drones that closely document the villages and their residents. I feel that the settlers constantly see us, take pictures of us, and even hear us. They use drones that reach the yard of the house to follow us, where we graze, to see if we have built a new building, or just to harass us so that we will give up and leave, said Samia, this time decisively. She adds that her greatest fear is that soldiers will break into the house when she is not wearing a hijab, as happened when soldiers came in the middle of the night and arrested her son. We were sleeping inside the cave, and suddenly they came at night, knocked harshly on the door. They ordered us to open the door and gave us no chance to even put on the headdress. They broke into the cave, conducted a search, and took my son. Mental health, life with fear. One of the most difficult insights that emerged from the interviews that because reality is so difficult, the women, and we as well, are primarily concerned with material difficulties. Is there a roof over their head? Is there food, work, transportation, school, livelihood? Only at the end, and not often, that a woman pauses to ask, how does this affect me? How am I supposed to process all this and maintain my mental health? Samia put it well when asked, but how do you deal with all this? There are no mental therapy response here. Doctors hardly come to treat the physically ill. Unfortunately, I could not pay enough attention to the children's mental state. I was on my own and without resources. To each one of us, there is a clear role in order for us to survive and stay alive in our home. This means returning from school to herding sheep and working in the household, and only in the evening to sit down to study when only one lamp illuminates their books. The issue of mental health was not brought up proactively by any of the women. Throughout the interviews, the women talked about unbearably difficult experiences, but they did not linger even for a moment to talk about their inner feelings. They understand the feelings with words such as fear, anger, helplessness, but do not give these feelings a significant place in the conversation. For example, Samia, who told about the upheavals of the deportation and the demolitions, was particularly troubled and moved when she remembered the arrest of her children. The army came in the middle of the night when we were sleeping. Suddenly we heard dogs barking and loud knocks on the door until a soldier broke the door and carried my son away. We women were inside the room, and they almost attacked my daughter, who was pregnant. My children were arrested several times due to false complaints by settlers, but it shakes me up every time. I summoned up the courage and asked Samia, but how do you feel, Samia? And she answered, fear is a constant feeling. Even today, despite everything we've been through, the horror of the deportation preoccupies my sons' and daughters' thoughts. Do you realize that my children, who are still children, must help their father rebuild the house and the shed every time and after every demolition? It's a lot for children. Samia immediately added, are you asking how I feel? I was also tired, but I suppressed it. I had to stay strong and have the time to do everything. There was no time to reflect on my mental health. I was busy raising them and taking care of them. Asil also adopted a position similar to that of her mother. We do not have time to sulk in our fears. We need to think about how to stay brave and strong. As Asil and I walked to the side, I again raised the question about her emotional state. This time she replied, over time, I recognize how much this fear affects me. I developed sleep problems and a feeling that everything is temporary. This feeling oppresses me a lot, but I cannot give up and cannot give in to this fear. There is no doubt that the women, as the ones who bear the task of education and care, are the ones who mainly bear the burden of the immediate and long-term consequences of their trauma and that of their children. Added to this burden is the sense of helplessness of the women, the mothers, in the face of their children's plight, when they are unable to help or even address the anxieties that develop and shape their future, not to mention a professional response that does not exist. The fear of the ruins sounds like it dwarfs the fear described by Harun's mother, Farsa. I felt an earthquake hit me when I saw him fall on the ground in front of my eyes. I felt that I had lost everything. Everything. I held him and saw that he was closing his eyes and that his body was not moving. I started shouting for an ambulance to be brought. The soldiers kept shooting in the air. They went away from us, but kept shooting in the air. Ashraf, the neighbor, brought the car so we could take him to the hospital, and then the same soldiers shot the wheels of the car so as to prevent us from driving. Since the shooting of Harun, his mother and his 15-year-old sister have to feed him all the time. This unbearable task lays on the shoulders of these women. Even when his father would come to visit him at the hospital, Harun would ask me to come back. He would beg me to be the one at his bedside, the mother said, describing how her whole world was put on hold in order for her to take care of her son, who is bedridden 24/7. Since the shooting of Harun, my life has all revolved around my son. I do not do anything that is not related to Harun. I try to do everything to help him. During the treatment period in the Israeli hospital, I was with Harun all the time, and even though my daughters at home needed me and would call and cry for me to come back, I could not leave him. I would come home for one night and go back to the hospital the next day. Even his sister, despite her young age, found herself being a second mother to her older brother. I helped my mother clean the pressure sores, carry my brother, help bathe him and change his clothes. At first it was difficult and embarrassing for me, but I had no choice to do it, and I got used to it. Over time, I also started to suffer from back pain. Do you manage to get to school? I asked. Yes, I try, answered the teenage sister. The two, the mother and the sister, testified that they were not given any real possibility to receive proper psychological support. We are busy with Harun, they concluded, in a kind of complacency. On the scarcity of dreams, a childhood denied and an ability to dream denied. The interviews were conducted on the days of the Muslim holiday of Al-Adha. A group of organizations held a voluntary celebratory activity in the village of Susia, which is located near the firing zone and is also threatened with demolition on the grounds of illegal construction. Boys and girls from all over the region came to the village, and they participated in a day of activities that included handing out gifts, reading stories, dancing with a children's operator, and a workshop under the title, What is Your Dream? What is your dream seems like a simple question. But the answer became about the very essence of life. The scarcity of dreams and their dearth were revealed. The boys and girls who sat in the circle rushed to share their dreams and aspirations. That my sister receives treatment, answered one. That the settlers will leave us in peace, said another loudly. Life without fear. May the army leave. Go to school. To have my own room. May the demolition stop. May my father return. The girls and the children scattered dreams everywhere. Listening to these simple dreams, which are supposed to come naturally to every boy and girl, was like a kick in the stomach. The reality of life in Masafer Yatta does not allow boys and girls the possibility of expanding their imagination. Even children's dreams are trapped. When the workshop moderator insisted everyone dreams of something beyond, and asked, beyond and apart from demolitions and settlers, what do you dream of? One of the girls replied, to see the sea. Then this dream was repeated by the rest of the girls and boys, seeing the sea and the fish. The sea and the fish seemed like a distant dream. So far away. Outside the half-open, half-closed space where the workshop was held in the village of Susia stands a colorful playground, a very unusual place in the landscape, which was established with the help of humanitarian aid. On the garden's gate, the civil administration posted a sign that said, Demolition Order. In our interviews, we tried to ask the older girls, Asil, Amira, and Ra'em, to ignore reality, even just a little bit, and to separate their personal dreams from the collective dream. Asil said, what could I dream about? I live with a cloud of fear hanging over my head, over our heads. Sometimes I am happy and satisfied with the path I have made for myself, and that I am learning and advancing, but as long as the danger of deportation and dispossession hangs over us, I cannot move forward in achieving my dreams. Asil's words emphasized how difficult it is to separate from the daily lived reality, to develop an independent and unique personality, and to be a subject devoid of context in such a reality. Ra'em, who was a few years older than Asil and is still trying to make her way to university, had a dream of becoming a policewoman. Before I saw the soldiers assaulting my brother, I wanted so much to become a policewoman. But since my brother was injured and became disabled, everything turned upside down. Now I cannot dream for myself. I have a responsibility. That is why I decided to study nursing, to help take care of my brother. The effect of the crisis on discrimination and gender-based violence. In a reality where women are still fighting for their rights in all areas of life, times of crisis may exacerbate oppression and discrimination based on gender. This is especially true among populations that suffer from several cycles of oppression, as is in the case of the women from Masafer Yatta. Ethnic oppression and gender oppression. In such a case, the ethnic oppression, the women explain, makes the men want to regain the power they lost, and they take out their anger on the weaker link, the women. They are powerless in the face of poverty, in front of the soldiers, in front of the settlers. Every day their dignity is trampled outside the home. Only at home can they practice their power, said one of the women, with a kind of forgiveness, a kind of understanding, and hurries to emphasize that she does not suffer any physical violence. We knew very well that this issue was a sensitive issue on several levels. First, the interviews with these women had a clear context, the deportation and the injustices of the occupation. Accordingly, any other issues, certainly issues of gender equality or gender violence that are still seen as personal issues and are not talked about, are seen as a distraction from more acute issues in their eyes. Second, as in any society that suffers from several circles of oppression, collective oppression has a higher status in the order of priorities. Issues such as gender equality, which can be controversial among the ethnic group, are seen as having a secondary priority and as hindering the group's struggle. Third, some of the women we spoke with hold the view that gender violence or inequality is a dysfunction rather than a root cause in a reality dominated by patriarchal worldviews. These women, who were born and raised in traditional societies, are very dependent on men economically and socially, so that any challenge against discriminatory or offensive treatment puts them in danger. Fourth, and this is how we reminded ourselves, we are for these women, foreign women. We knew we could not afford to pry, to talk about topics the local women did not want to talk about. To all of this, in addition to the fact that these women, most of whom have not acquired an education and are not integrated into the labor market outside the home, live in an area that lacks basic living conditions and is almost cut off from the outside world. Without the help of the men, they cannot leave their villages. These women, even if they needed it, have no response to primary and basic welfare services. The government, the state, the one responsible for their personal security, are the ones who oppress them, destroy their homes, deprive them of their lands, and aim to deport them. To whom shall I complain? This is what one woman among the interviewees wondered, the only one who shared with us that her husband sometimes beats her. It happens when he is angry, for example, with his father. His father controls him and he is powerless against him, so I become the target, said, adding, over time I learned to ignore it. This is the only solution I have. I live far from my parents. I cannot get out of here. There is no escape. That's why I learned to deal with it. You will mock me now, she told me, but I learned to deal with it with a smile, the way violence cannot subdue me. The phenomenon of violence within the family is one of the manifestations of the inferior status of the women in Masafer Yatta. Both child marriage and polygamy are widespread and common phenomena. The connection of silence with regard to discrimination and gender violence causes these phenomena to continue to worsen in emergencies and crisis situations, such as the one facing the communities of Masafer Yatta. While other hardships receive some exposure, hardships suffered by women, including the status of women in society, almost disappear from the discourse. This is true in relation to humanitarian aid, which is provided by international organizations, which mainly addresses the general hardships of the residents of the communities. There is a difficulty in speaking on behalf of the women and claiming things that are not claimed by the women themselves, since this can be perceived as cultural paternalism. At the same time, there is no doubt that in order for the women themselves to be able to discuss all their hardships, they need to be empowered and strengthen their status as independent individuals. Summary: raise your voices. When we explained to the women why we were interviewing them, they showed great willingness to participate and share their stories. Hope is running out for them over time, and it is clear that they understand that without public and international intervention, they may find themselves without a home soon. We promised to give a platform to their voices, and this is what we tried to do throughout this document, in the hopes that these voices will fall on attentive ears and souls who desire justice and equality. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 instructs that the gender context and the point of view of women in armed conflicts and crisis areas must be taken into account. The unique vulnerability of women in these conflicts, which sabotages their ability to grow and develop, take care of themselves and their children. As we have seen, situations of crisis and displacement from home block women's access to the most basic resources that in a just world would belong to all people, all women. In order to protect them, Resolution 1325 states that women must be integrated equally in the relevant institutions and must be involved in the decision-making processes. Over the years, Masafer Yatta communities have held onto their lands at home, but the communities, including the women, are under an occupying and foreign military rule. This means that they, the communities, are not part of the decision-making centers, and they do not have the power to choose the men or women who sit around the table, carving out their fate. Although the State of Israel is allegedly committed to Resolution 1325, in practice it does not fill this commitment, to say the least. The longstanding policy of preventing anything on the developing and planning horizon, home demolitions, denying access to basic infrastructure such as water and electricity, denying access to basic services such as education and medicine, the permit regime that controls the movement of all residents, declaration of state lands, declaration of firing zones, enclosed military areas, taking over land for the purpose of settlements, building in the occupied territory in violation of international law, military violence, settler violence backed by the army, and more. All of these constitute practices of dispossessing the Palestinians, a population protected under international law, dispossessing them of their land, and trying to compress them within the main Palestinian cities in areas A and B, thus interrupting the territorial continuity of any future Palestinian state. Cleaning and purifying Area C from Palestinians will be the step that will allow Israel to annex it, as much territory as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. The decision to expel the Palestinian residents from Masafer Yatta embodies all of this. As stated in the introduction, the legal battle in Israel reached a dead end with the court authorizing the deportation while turning its back on international law and the obligations existing under it. Transformations on the ground, as we have discussed some of them, are sure to come, and every day new facts are established on the ground, and the heavy prices that the women pay disappear in the general discourse. Turning the spotlight on these hardships as well is the least we could do. We have but to embrace the demands of Palestinian women and call on you all, women and men who are around the decision-making table and those who have access to or influence on the decision-making centers, to do the same. Speak up. The demands of the Palestinian women from Masafer Yatta are clear and basic. Stop the violation of our rights. Stop the deportation. Join our fight to protect our home, our children's rights to education and health, to movement, to privacy, to safe living with dignity, and our right to self-determination.